Welcome to the Bible Study Pal podcast. My name is Greg Circle, the preacher for the Church of Christ that meets in Palmyra, Indiana. This year, we are going through the Psalms. The goal of the podcast is to read the Psalms and talk about the words and the ideas that we find in them to prepare for the Bible studies and sermons that will be presented during our regular meeting times. Sunday at 9:15 a.m. for Bible classes for all ages, 10 a.m. for our morning worship, 5 p.m. for our evening worship, and Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. for our midweek Bible classes again for all ages. The Bible classes and sermons will come from the New Testament connections to the Psalms that we read and study in this podcast. I will mention the connections I see, but you are invited to comment below if you are watching/listening on a platform that allows that, or email preacher@palmyrachurchofchrist.org with your own comments, questions, observations, and connections that you make. All readings and scripture quotations will come from the 1769 standardization of the King James Version. Before we begin this episode of the podcast, I'd like to thank everyone for their prayers. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been under the weather with the family at home, so thank you for your prayers. I am feeling a whole lot better. I'm a little bit delayed in getting my voice back up to snuff, so there won't be any singing in today's episode of the podcast. We will simply do the reading of the Psalms, some analysis, if you want to call it that, and the New Testament references and lesson ideas that I have for each section of Psalm 18. Today's podcast episode is one psalm. It's a psalm of 50 verses, and we're going to break it up into 4 chunks and go through the lessons that would be this week. Psalm 18, verses 1 through 15 for the Week 6 midweek Bible class. This psalm begins with a sort of a prologue, and it's the same psalm as in 2 Samuel 22 with a couple of minor differences, but just like the beginning of 2 Samuel 22, this psalm does begin in the superscription with a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord who spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord, and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even into his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters, and thick clouds of the skies. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. This Thanksgiving psalm is, again, also from 2 Samuel 22, and with a couple of minor differences. This is the song that David sang to Yahweh after he had finally been delivered from his enemies. And then by the end of this psalm, it is a full-on praise psalm. In verses 1 through 3, we read about how important it is that Yahweh is in the life of the psalmist. He cannot live without him. There is a love for Yahweh because of the protection that he affords David. Can we sing this psalm with David? In verses 4 through 6, we read, first of all, an interesting word, the ungodly men, in verse 4, in other translations as chaos or vileness. But this is a word that we're familiar with if we've been in the New Testament for any length of time, Belial. It's interesting to point out that just before this song in 2 Samuel, David had a run-in with a vile fellow, a fellow of Belial. His name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. As we talked about in another episode, Saul was a Benjamite. This man convinced the men of Israel to not follow David as king, and thus began a civil war, 2 Samuel 20, verses 1 and 2. David knew that he could die in the midst of this Belial. this vileness, this chaos, these ungodly men. The cords of death and the grave were all around him. What could he do? Nothing but call to God for help, and God heard him. And listen to what happens when Yahweh hears the pleas of his faithful servant. In verse 7, we read about how no one can stand when Yahweh comes to rescue his faithful servants. Sometimes, even when the enemies are trying to execute judgment against the faithful, they cannot stand. Daniel 3 and verse 22 speaks of the time when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were about to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And as the king, as the emperor was ordering people to execute this judgment, the furnace was so hot, they made the furnace so hot that those men who were attempting to execute this judgment died outside of that furnace. They could not stand in the judgment of God's faithful. Although God's faithful, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did stand. In verses 8 through 14, you can read those verses again and ask yourself about how this would make a great scene in a movie, a wonderful battle scene. Try to picture the battle that is being described in these verses. Concluding with what we read in verse 15. With everything done and the battle won, we see the devastation that occurred. And while it may not be what he wants to see, he'd rather have no enemies but friends. He could not allow his faithful to bow and give his enemies that great reward. Enemies extreme could have joined the team, but they opted for ignominious ends. As for the New Testament references and lesson ideas that we have, I think for the Bible class on Wednesday night, which if you're listening to this after it's posted, you know I'm not going to make it to, I would have talked about the translation of Belial and its use in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 15. For the Week 6 Sunday morning Bible class, we'll read verses 16 through 24. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and I did not put away his statutes from me. I was also upright before him, and I kept myself from mine iniquity. Therefore hath the Lord recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his eyesight. To apply verses 16 through 19 to us, Yahweh reaches down to help us who depend on him. He draws us out of our troubles in which we might drown. When our enemies are strong, but he in us delights, he brings us to a safe place to continue the fights. But how can we delight our Creator? Verses 20 through 24 gives us the same lesson as James 4 verse 8 does. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners. Keep to his ways. Keep from iniquity, because the Lord repays. I think the lesson that I might look at for the Sunday morning Bible class comes from verse 16, and we might look at the parallel, or what might be a parallel here, to Jesus pulling Peter out of the Sea of Galilee in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. For the Week 6 Sunday morning sermon, we'll be looking at the New Testament connections to verses 25 through 36 of the 18th Psalm. With the merciful thou wilt show thyself merciful. With an upright man thou wilt show thyself upright. With the pure thou wilt show thyself pure. And with the froward thou wilt show thyself froward. For thou wilt save the afflicted people, but wilt bring down high looks. For thou wilt light my candle. The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. For by thee I have run through a troop, and by my God I have leaped over a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a buckler to all those that trust in him. For who is God save the Lord? Or who is a rock save our God? It is God that girdeth me with strength, and maketh my way perfect. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and setteth me upon my high places. He teacheth my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken by mine arms. Thou hast also given me the shield of thy salvation, and thy right hand hath holden me up, and thy gentleness hath made me great. Thou hast enlarged my steps under me, that my feet did not slip. Verses 25 and 26 talks about how God treats people the way they treat others. And I wonder if this is why the golden rule is so important. Do unto others as you want them to do to you, because they just might, or at least someone might, and God will. The King James Version has a word in these verses that we rarely use, froward. It is the opposite of toward or toward. So that would mean froward. To, the opposite of to is fromward. We would more likely use the word untoward, even though that's kind of an archaic word in and of itself. And it's not exactly the same, but it's close. The English word froward or untoward. Untoward is a little less severe than froward. Froward means to be obstinate or adverse. Probably froward is more obstinate and untoward is more adverse. The words translated froward, there are two different words in the Hebrew. The Hebrew words mean crooked or twisted, with the first seeming to have the connotation of perverse, while the second is more like cunning. So with the perverse, the Lord is cunning. I suppose the idea is that with those who would try to trick their neighbor into a disadvantage, God will turn their trickery around to their disadvantage. And that is what is next explained in verse 27. For thou wilt save the afflicted people, but will bring down high looks. And in verses 28 and 29, the psalmist remembers and recounts the ways that he has shown humility. The psalmist has shown humility. He trusts the Lord to give him the light to direct his feet on the right path. Without God, there's nothing but darkness. He depends on God to win his battles. Without God, there is no victory. How does God give us a victory? Verse 30, he shows us his way. His way is perfect. It is always right. If we follow his way, we will never go astray. It has been tested. It has been tried. No other advice has a better success rate. If you want a defense of innocence, look to the Lord and wait. In verses 31 through 34, we have this great little snippet. Who is God except Yahweh? Who is a rock except our God? He is the only one who can strengthen us completely. His is the only way that is perfect. He makes it to where we can climb him to get away from the predators below. His word is so righteous that victory is assured. By the strength of his teaching, we can render the enemy's weapons useless. In verses 35 and 36, first of all, going back to verse 30, the word buckler in the King James Version and shield here in these verses is the same Hebrew word. And so the psalmist is trying to bring back the idea from above. It's a recapitulation of the ideas. Repetition for the sake of both artistic emphasis and life application. God's right hand has helped the psalmist up onto the protective heights. He's shown the path up the mountain, and his gentleness had made the psalmist great. For the New Testament references and lesson ideas for the AM sermon, we might look at verse 27 and how it's found in James chapter 4 and verse 6 and 1 Peter 5 and verse 5, in direct quotation. God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. And this is reiterated in the hymn that is sung in the verses that follow, concluding with, Your gentleness has made me great. For the Week 6 Sunday evening sermon, we'll look at the New Testament references and connections to verses 37 through 50. I have pursued mine enemies and overtaken them, neither did I turn again till they were consumed. I have wounded them, that they were not able to rise. They are fallen under my feet. For thou hast girded me with strength unto the battle. Thou hast subdued under me those that rose up against me. Thou hast also given me the necks of mine enemies, that I might destroy them that hate me. They cried, but there was none to save them, even unto the Lord, but he answered them not. Then did I beat them small as the dust before the wind. I did cast them out as the dirt in the streets. Thou hast delivered me from the strivings of the people, and thou hast made me the head of the heathen. A people whom I have not known shall serve me. As soon as they hear of me, they shall obey me. The strangers shall submit themselves unto me. The strangers shall fade away and be afraid out of their close places. The Lord liveth, and blessed be my rock, and let the God of my salvation be exalted. It is God that avengeth me, and subdueth the people under me. He delivereth me from mine enemies. Yea, thou liftest me up above those that rise up against me. Thou hast delivered me from the violent man. Therefore will I give thanks unto thee, O Lord, among the heathen, and sing praises unto thy name. Great deliverance giveth he to his king, and showeth mercy to his anointed, to David, and to his seed forevermore. This is where the thanksgiving psalm slips into all-out praise. While the psalmist has sung of his dependence upon God for protection and victory, he still recognizes his victory and praises God for it. In verses 37 through 42, we see the victory described. How did he achieve this victory? Well, first of all, in verse 37, he never quit. In verse 38, he went for a total victory. Verse 39, he remembered God's role in this victory. Verse 40, going along with the idea of total victory, he offers no quarter, takes no prisoners. Why does he do that? Verse 41, because God gave them up. Verse 42, it's time to clean house and take out the trash. Now, would this be about any sort of victory that we may be given, or is there something else at play here? In verses 43 through 45, this is where things get interesting, right? Hindsight being 20/20 or better, we see Jesus. Why did the Gentiles rage and the people plot vain things? Why did the people at the foot of the cross wag their heads and mock the crucified Jesus of Nazareth? They strove against the Messiah, their Messiah, and God delivered him. Then God made him the head over all things to the church, which included not only people of Jewish descent, but also Gentile. As soon as they heard of him, for sure some mocked, but others came out of their fortresses and believed and obeyed. Verses 46 through 48, in those verses we see the praise to God, the living God. Vengeance is his. He will repay. He will deliver his own from the violence of men. And in verses 49 and 50, we read about how, therefore, we give thanks to God, we confess God, and we sing God's praises among the heathen. This way, they can hear about our God, their God, and do the same. Yahweh is a great deliverer. There's a song that sings about God delivering Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the well, and then the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace, so the good book do declare. He's delivered this preacher from a couple of bears, but the psalmist's focus here is on the deliverance of David from Saul and Saul's tribe, the Benjamites. He also has us look forward to his seed, masculine singular, whom God would deliver from the grave. For our evening sermon, we'll probably look at the quote, verse 49 in Romans chapter 15 and verse 9, which is the verse that makes this psalm about and by Jesus, God the Son. Paul also discusses how God had delivered him and his fellow missionaries from so great a peril of death, 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. So this psalm has application on several levels. Does it apply to us? If so, how? Thank you for listening to the Bible Study PAL podcast, a ministry of the Church of Christ that meets in Palmyra, Indiana. We'd love to see you visit at 14175 Green Street Northeast, just south of the intersection of U.S. Route 150 and Indiana Route 135. We begin our worship at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. each Sunday, and we have Bible classes for all ages Sunday morning at 9:15 and Wednesday evening at 6:30. You can watch the live stream of our Sunday morning worship at youtube.com/@BibleStudyPal. If you would like to contact us, you can email preacher@PalmyraChurchOfChrist.org or give us a phone call, 812-364-6215. You can keep up with our special events and community announcements on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Palmyra.Church of Christ. Thank you for listening.